From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
All systems, all living systems were altered by the fallout from Chernobyl, no exceptions. In Belarus, which is north of where Chernobyl was, that only 20% of the children are considered healthy. Only 20%. And that's by governmental data.
25 years ago today, a deadly explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, the worst nuclear disaster in history. Today, a quarter of a century later, the world faces a new nuclear catastrophe in Japan. What lessons have been learned? What's next? Then major U.S. weapons contractor Honeywell pleads guilty to illegally storing hazardous radioactive waste without a permit. Now workers who helped expose the problem say the company wants to bust their union. And we'll go to London to speak with David Lee in London for more on the newly released WikiLeaks documents on Guantanamo. Also, whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg on the ongoing imprisonment of Bradley Manning.
We have an act of free speech, of free press, of informing the public, an act in search of a crime, in search of a law that would call it criminal. No one had ever been prosecuted for what I had done then, revealing top secrets. There had been many leaks in the past, then as now, and no one had ever been prosecuted. I was the first.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Syrian security forces have arrested some 500 pro-democracy activists after the Syrian government sent in tanks to try to crush protests in the city of Daraa. At least 23 civilians were killed Monday when tanks shelled the coastal city. Security forces have now killed over 400 civilians since protests erupted last month. While Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is coming under increasing international criticism, the White House has not declared that Assad has lost the legitimacy to rule as Obama declared in the case of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. On Monday, White House spokesperson Jay Carney said sanctions are being considered.
We are pursuing a range of possible options, including targeted sanctions. I should note for those who don't know that we have had a fairly aggressive regime of sanctions in place, unilateral sanctions, since, I believe, 2003. And this would be in addition to that if we were to pursue that course of action. But we're certainly looking at different ways to make clear to the Syrian government how appalling we find this behavior to be, and to encourage them both, as we have by speaking out against it, but in other means, to stop the violence and to move towards serious reform.
In news on Libya, Italy has announced it will begin using its air force to bomb military targets in Libya in the latest escalation by NATO forces. Italy had previously said it would not take part in NATO-led airstrikes, citing its 40-year colonial rule of Libya. Meanwhile, forces loyal to Gaddafi are continuing to shell the city of Misrata. There are reports Gaddafi's forces are using human shields in the city. In Afghanistan, NATO forces are saying they've killed a senior al-Qaeda leader named Abdul Ghani. The Saudi-born commander has been described as the second most wanted insurgent in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Taliban has taken credit for orchestrating Monday's massive jailbreak in Kandahar that freed nearly 500 imprisoned fighters. The Taliban built a massive tunnel underneath the high-security prison. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon says he lacks the authority to personally order a probe into the mass killings of civilians by the Sri Lankan military in 2009. A UN panel says there's evidence both the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers committed war crimes when the Sri Lankans launched a massive offensive assault on Tamil separatists. The White House is publicly criticizing news organizations for publishing leaked files about Guantanamo that were first obtained by WikiLeaks. The documents reveal the U.S. has held 150 innocent men at the base. Jay Carney is the White House press secretary.
Condemn in the strongest possible terms. And we think it's unfortunate that the New York Times and others news organizations have made the decision to publish numerous documents obtained illegally concerning the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay.
We'll have more on the Guantanamo files later in the program. We'll be speaking with the investigations editor at The Guardian in London, David Lee, and with the world-renowned whistleblower Dan Ellsberg. A new report is warning that soaring global food prices could threaten to push 60 million Asians into extreme poverty. According to the Asian Development Bank, domestic food inflation in developing Asian nations hit 10% at the start of this year as the price of wheat, corn, sugar, dairy products and meat soared. Amnesty International is criticizing Brazil's plans to demolish the homes of many residents living in the slums or favelas of Rio de Janeiro ahead of the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympic Games. Amnesty International Secretary General Salil Shetty is in Brazil this week.
Everybody fully understands that some degree of movement might be inevitable when you're undergoing such a major project. The issue really is as to whether the fair process is being followed. So, I mean, these people have been given houses, apartments 50 kilometers away from their place of livelihood, or compensations which are, really a pittance. And the communities are not really involved.
In political news, Republican Congressman Ron Paul of Texas has announced he's forming a presidential exploratory committee. Meanwhile, Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour, the former Washington lobbyist, surprised many Monday by announcing he will not run in the 2012 presidential race. The National Labor Relations Board's preparing to sue the states of Arizona and South Dakota over state laws that require workers to hold secret ballot elections before a company can be unionized. The NLRB says the state laws conflict with federal law that gives employers the option to recognize a union if a majority of workers simply sign cards, a process known as card check. A pair of iPhone users have filed a lawsuit against Apple, claiming the company's secretly recording movements of iPhone and iPad users. The suit comes a week after technology researchers revealed the iPhone had been designed to secretly track a user's location and store information on the device for a year without the user's knowledge. Attorney Aaron Mayer said, quote, "We take issue specifically with the notion that Apple's now basically tracking people everywhere they go. If you're a federal marshal, you have to have a warrant to do this kind of thing, and Apple is doing it without one." Residents of Texas City, Texas, have been ordered to stay inside their homes after oil refineries run by BP and Marathon Oil, as well as a Dow chemical plant, lost power last night. Local residents were ordered inside to avoid breathing smoke from the refinery's flares. A small fire broke out at the BP refinery after the power outage, but workers at the facility were able to extinguish it. No injuries were reported. In 2005, an explosion at the Texas City BP refinery killed 15 workers. Last year, BP allowed 538,000 pounds of chemicals to escape from the refinery without telling local residents. Immigrant rights advocates are calling on New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to formalize and expand an immigration pardon panel established last year under former Governor David Paterson. The panel was designed to allow immigrants the opportunity to defend themselves from being deported. Since major changes in immigration laws in 1996, millions of immigrants have been deported for minor crimes and crimes they were already punished for. Mizue Izeki heads the Northern Manhattan Coalition for Immigrant Rights.
You're funneling people into a system where they have no way to get out. It's a mandatory deportation, and this is a system that needs to be examined very critically. And so we're calling on Governor Cuomo, to institute this pardon panel that would allow at least many immigrants a second chance to be like, look, this is my life. I've rehabilitated. Would you please give me another chance? And I think it's important to remind people that this is basically a premise of our society, that you should not be punished doubly for something that you've already done your time.
The law firm hired by Republicans in the House of Representatives to defend the constitutionality of the Defense of Marriage Act has withdrawn from its agreement. King & Spalding said defending a law which prohibits recognition of same-sex marriages would hurt its capacity to attract and retain attorneys. The attorney hired to lead the case, Paul Clement, resigned from the firm following the decision. Clement served as Solicitor General under President George W. Bush. And in news about this week's royal wedding, British gay rights campaigners attempted to deliver an early wedding card to Buckingham Palace Monday, calling on Prince William and Kate Middleton to express their support for same-sex marriages. The Reverend Sharon Ferguson heads the lesbian and gay Christian movement.
What we want is for gay couples to have the right to be able to get married and for straight couples to have the right to have a civil partnership if that's what they wish. So we've already lodged our application with the European Court of Human Rights and today we are here to present a card to Will and Kate, wishing them all the best on their upcoming nuptials and asking them to please support the fact for gay people to be able to also get married. I want to be able to marry my partner and at the moment I don't have that opportunity.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. It was 25 years ago today when a deadly explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the former Soviet state of Ukraine led to what was then the worst nuclear disaster in history. The Chernobyl blast was 400 times more powerful than the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. It sent a cloud of radioactive fallout into Russia, Belarus, and over a large portion of Europe. 50,000 people living in Chernobyl's immediate surroundings had to be evacuated. A vast rural region became uninhabitable, and public authorities were forced to put restrictions on the sale and import of food to reduce the risk of radiation-induced cancer deaths among their populations. A study by the New York Academy of Sciences in 2009 concluded the death toll from Chernobyl was as high as 1 million. Children born in the plant's vicinity continue experiencing high levels of birth defects, especially severe brain damage. In this clip from the 2003 documentary, Chernobyl Heart, a nurse at a children's care facility applies medication to the severely infected and mutated hands of a little boy.
I think he's in danger of losing his hands.
Okay. It's for you.
Is there a relationship between radiation from Chernobyl and what is wrong with the kids you see?
I think so, of course. I've been working here for 19 years. I can definitely say that the children before were not as mentally deficient, and now they have more physical and mental handicaps. They were born with some kind of abnormality and were abandoned.
You seem like you're about to cry. Are you always this close to tears?
I can't handle this. I have 2 children myself.
Of 3, Steve. That was a clip from Chernobyl Heart, a 2003 documentary film by Marianne DeLeo. The film won the Best Documentary Short Subject Award at the 2004 Academy Awards. Chernobyl's one of only 2 nuclear accidents to ever receive a Level 7 classification on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The other was just recently Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power accident that occurred last month in Japan. Today, environmental activists are demonstrating on the Chernobyl plant to mark the 25th anniversary and raise awareness about the current nuclear fallout in Japan. A nuclear expert from Greenpeace International in Russia explained why he's participating in the protest.
Точно 25 лет назад здесь начиналась Чернобыльская катастрофа. 6 недель назад мы видели...
The Chernobyl catastrophe began exactly here 25 years ago. 6 weeks ago, we saw the Japanese atomic catastrophe. What else are we waiting for? We urgently need to move to alternative sources of energy, wind, solar energy, the use of biomass energy. All this exists. It just needs a political will to move to alternative energy sources.
A full quarter of a century after Chernobyl, the world's faced with a new nuclear catastrophe, this time in Japan. To discuss further what took place 25 years ago, we're joined by Dr. Janet Sherman. She edited the book Chernobyl, Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and Nature. She's joining us from Arlington, Virginia, joining us from PBS station WETA. We're also joined by Dr. Jeff Patterson. He's the immediate past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. He visited Chernobyl after the disaster. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Jeff Patterson, let's begin with you. Talk about what happened 25 years ago today and what you saw when you went there afterwards.
Well,
A month after the accident, which irradiated a huge area and the radiation went worldwide, I was in Germany, East and West Germany, touring and lecturing. I was in Marburg, a university town much like Madison. After my lecture, the mayor of Marburg came up to me and said, "What should I tell people? I get different answers from my radiation specialists, from my medical doctors, from my engineers. I don't know what to tell people." And I think this is the situation today. 2 years after Chernobyl, I was in Chernobyl, and while we were touring around the plant where they were still washing down the streets, there were men grading dirt up that was highly radioactive. They wore no respirators, no protection whatsoever. And I asked my guide, how are you monitoring the radiation levels on these people? And he said, oh, they all wear badges. And I said, where's your badge? And he opened his coat and said, I guess I left it at home today. And this is exemplary of what was done after Chernobyl, where 600,000 to 800,000 workers came in and sacrificed some of their lives for the cleanup. And the records on many of those workers are simply gone. They've disappeared. I spoke recently with a physicist who was involved with monitoring the radiation at the plant at that time, and he said these workers had no protection. They wore paper masks that they often didn't wear, and he said he's tried to find the records in the Ukraine, and they've simply disappeared. And he himself did not know how much radiation he received at the time of that accident. So I think this is an example of the confusion, the difficulty in monitoring radiation, and the history of the nuclear industry, which has been one of secrecy, cover-up, and minimization of the damage that occurs.
Let's go to Janet Sherman. Dr. Janet Sherman, describe what happened on this day 25 years ago in Chernobyl. Even place it for us physically.
Well, there had been a decision to do a test on the reactor, and they was started on the day shift, and then it couldn't happen, so they postponed it to the afternoon shift, and finally it was undertaken on the night shift, where people were not prepared, and they achieved a runaway nuclear reaction, which they could not control, and had an explosion that we're contending with ever since. We still, even though it's 25 years later, we're still dealing with the radiation at Chernobyl. It's still leaking out of the reactor. The so-called containment that was built around it is crumbling. And there is really no way to control this. There is a proposal to build a steel shell that will come from two different directions and close over the top of the reactor. But the funding hasn't been achieved yet, and it's a long way off before this will ever be built.
Dr. Jeff Patterson, the casualties of Chernobyl 25 years ago are wide-ranging. Some say 4,500 people died. Others, well, a study by the New York Academy of Sciences in 2009 concluded the death toll from Chernobyl was as high as 1 million. What are the figures?
Well, I think we do have a wide range of figures, and I don't think we know for sure. When we look at the Hiroshima data, this Hiroshima bomb was a one-time dose of radiation that occurred 65 years ago, and we're still seeing new cancers and new deaths from that. And again, that was a one-time dose of radiation. This radiation goes on and on because it's nuclides that are put into the atmosphere and now in the ground and water and continue to expose people. So we honestly don't know the end of this experiment, and we're going to have to watch it for literally hundreds of years to see what's going to happen. I think that it's safe to say that the results are far worse than certainly the conservative estimates. And the other issue is the Hiroshima data has cost billions of dollars to accumulate, and we've been looking at that for 65 years, and we still don't have the end answer to that question. So here we are with far more people exposed to continuing radiation. This is truly an experiment that we're not going to see the end of. and that the results of which will be visited on our children and grandchildren for generations to come.
And this figure that the Chernobyl blast was 400 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Could you explain that?
Well, it's a little difficult because the bomb was exploded 1,000 feet in the air, and so it was a one-time dose of radiation. The thermal energy initially killed about 100,000 people, and subsequently 100,000 or so more have died from the effects of the radiation and other injuries. And so the force of the blast is essentially what we're talking about here, and also the radiation effect. And I think the fact is that more radiation has been released from the Chernobyl plant, and that's, I think, where the figure of the 400 times more powerful comes from.
On the eve of the 25th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, President Dmitry Medvedev of Russia reiterated his commitment to the development of nuclear energy.
События последнего периода напомнили
The recent events have reminded humanity that we can't take things easy and that when making important decisions, it is necessary to take into account a whole range of issues which in the future might affect safety. Of course, I mean the situation around the Japanese Fukushima 1 nuclear plant. At the same time, we should not block development. The peaceful atom remains the cheapest and, in general, environmentally the cheapest type of energy.
Late last month, President Obama unveiled a new energy policy seeking to reduce the use of foreign oil while reaffirming also his commitment to nuclear power.
It's important to recognize that nuclear energy doesn't emit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So those of us who are concerned about climate change, we've got to recognize that nuclear power, if it's safe, can make a significant contribution to the climate change question. And we're going to incorporate those conclusions and lessons from Japan in design and the building of the next generation of plants. But we can't simply take it off the table.
Dr. Jeff Patterson, your response.
Well, I think nuclear power, nuclear energy has three poisonous Ps, and those are pollution, and we're certainly seeing the example of that now at the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl. That pollution occurs all along the fuel cycle, from the time we dig it out of the ground, the tailings that are left and expose people to radon, to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, to the production of fuel, and then we don't know where to bury the waste or what to do with it. And now we're seeing the catastrophic release of radiation once again, which happened at Kishtim in Russia, happened in Chernobyl, and now is happening in Fukushima, and will happen again. And so pollution is the first thing that is the poisonous P. Second is price. And as Medvedev said, he claims that this is the cheapest form of energy. It's by far and away the most expensive form of energy. When we figure in the results of these disasters and the cost to people's health, the economic loss, the agricultural loss, the Ukraine, in the initial days of this, spent 1/6 of their national budget on Chernobyl, and Belarus and Ukraine are still spending 5 to 7% of their national budgets every year to deal with the Chernobyl accident. If we figured all of that into the cost of nuclear power becomes extremely expensive. As Dr. Sherman mentioned, the next sarcophagus that they're proposing to build over the nuclear power plant, they're estimating will cost $1.1 billion, and they've only raised $800 million for this now. It's already 3 years behind time in terms of being built. And so the question is, will this ever get done? Because the cost of this is so much. The cost of building a new nuclear power plant is so expensive that chances are none will be built because nobody wants to fund them. And the third poisonous P is proliferation. Nuclear power and nuclear weapons go hand in hand. Medvedev talked about the peaceful atom that was designed by Eisenhower. Well, it's out of the peaceful atom program that has come nuclear weapons for many countries, and we're seeing the example of that in Iran today. So these are deadly parts of the nuclear experiment that we are conducting today that, in my opinion, is a highly unethical experiment.
An evacuation zone study is being released by your group, Dr. Jeff Patterson, Physicians for Social Responsibility, that shows there are many nuclear plants in the United States where there are much denser populations than there were around Hiroshima or Chernobyl. Can you talk about the news conference that you're heading off to right after you leave Democracy Now?
Yes. We're doing a presentation in which we've developed a map that you can click on and see in your area how near you are to a nuclear power plant, and then look at the evacuation zones out from that power plant. For example, in New York, there's a nuclear power plant 19 miles from New York City. So we're talking about, with an accident like Fukushima, potentially evacuating 20 million people. Well, if the Japanese are having trouble evacuating the folks from around their plant and are now changing the, quote, safe levels of radiation that children can be exposed to in the middle of the ball game here, imagine what it would be like in New York City when this accident might occur, and attempting to evacuate those people on a summer day, let alone in the middle of a snowstorm in New York City. So I would invite people to look at this and consider what this means for their lives. The mayor of South Miami, Florida, just wrote a letter after the Fukushima accident. He was trying to find out what the evacuation plans are for South Miami, which is 16 miles from a nuclear power plant. And he, as mayor, can't find out what will happen and feels that the plans are totally inadequate, including the plans to distribute potassium iodide. He tried to find out from the county how many tablets of potassium iodine were available, and they wouldn't tell him. So I think that the lesson in this is that wherever this happens in the world, it happens to us all. The radiation from Fukushima is here. We're still experiencing radiation from Chernobyl that has gone worldwide. And so no one is isolated from these accidents. And that no matter where it occurs, whether we blame the technology in Russia, whether we blame the tsunami, that we are all totally inadequately prepared to deal with this. We are attempting to manage the unmanageable. And so we need to rapidly move away from this and rapidly move away from nuclear weapons in the world.
Dr. Janet Sherman, you're known for a prophetic paper you wrote some 6 months before the Fukushima catastrophe, where you wrote, given the profound weather effects, earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, human fallibility, and military conflicts, many believe it's only a matter of time before there's another nuclear catastrophe. Can you talk more about this and what you feel needs to be done? I mean, you talked about this before Fukushima. You edited the book Chernobyl, the book that looks at the consequences of the catastrophe for people and nature, putting together a number of Russian writers about what took place. And you also talked about how the Russian government dealt with it and how governments should deal.
Well, we clearly need to, as a society, to say no to nuclear power because there is no way to control it. And as Dr. Patterson points out, these catastrophes will continue, and we simply, as a world society, cannot deal with them. When a nuclear reactor explodes, the radiation goes around the entire hemisphere. It is not confined to where the people live or where the accident occurred. effects are ubiquitous across all species. That's wild and domestic animals, birds, fish, bacteria, viruses, plants, and humans. So the effects are extremely serious, and they last for generations. We're terribly concerned about Belarus, where only 20% of the children are now considered healthy. So what do you do with a society if 80% of your population is sick? Who are going to be the artists and the musicians and the scientists and the teachers if your population is not well? We need to stop the use of nuclear power. We have other sources, conservation and solar and wind and biofuels. We need the population to rise up and say no more nuclear. It's not going to work, and it will just be a matter of time before there's yet another accident, such as is occurring at Fukushima Daiichi. We know now they still do not have this accident under control, and it's still releasing massive quantities of isotopes. And it's going to be a disaster for the Japanese population, but also it's spreading around, again, the Northern Hemisphere.
You had talked about the liquidators in Chernobyl, the people who went into the plant. Yes. And you also look at those in Japan and what it means for them. Explain their jobs and what it is they're exposed to.
Well, in Chernobyl, the liquidators were largely recruits. They were generally healthy young men and women, generally between the ages of 18 and 39 or so. Already by 2006, 15% had died, and now the data that is arriving to us is about 90% of the 800,000 recruits have bad health, and their children are particularly adversely affected. Now, we don't know if the cleanup workers in Japan are being protected or not. Certainly the Tyvek suits are not going to protect them from external radiation. The biggest concern is the inhalation and ingestion of radioisotopes, which are being released on a constant basis. We see that the cleanup workers in Japan are wearing respirators, but whether they are adequate or not, I have no idea. We're also not being given information on the levels of radiation to which they're exposed. Now, what they did in Chernobyl, they would send in some people to do some particularly dangerous work for maybe 15 minutes or half an hour, and then take them out because they'd received a lifetime dosage. We don't know what's occurring in Japan, particularly, and whether the workers are being adequately protected. It's very, very, very important to keep adequate records on exposures and the effect of the workers and make them publicly available, certainly not by the name of the individual person, but certainly the data needs to be available and transparent so scientists can follow what is happening to these people. The problem within Chernobyl was that they released almost no data for 3 years, and it was very, very difficult to reconstruct what was happening. And as Dr. Patterson pointed out, many of these records have disappeared, and indeed many records of nuclear workers in the United States have disappeared, and it has workers have a very hard time finding what their exposures were, even when they knew what their job description was.
Well, Dr. Janet Sherman, I want to thank you for being with us, specialist in internal medicine and toxicology, edited the book Chernobyl, Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and Nature, and Dr. Jeff Patterson, as you head off to the news conference of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Could you just describe Chernobyl to us today? What is it like?
Well, it's an area 30 kilometers in circumference that is totally out of bounds to humans. And no crops are grown there. Some people have moved back in. Large areas of the earth has been scraped off, trees cut down, and all of that earth has been buried in trenches. And now, as they are attempting to build the new sarcophagus, they're finding high levels of radiation in the ground with machinery that was buried immediately in the area. There are graveyards with tanks, buses, machines that are highly radioactive that are just sitting out in the open air. And interestingly enough, a recent report showed that the cesium levels around Chernobyl and in this zone and other zones have not diminished in the way that they predicted that they would. And so they don't know whether this is coming from cesium that's coming up through the soil, whether it's perhaps coming from new cesium that's being blown into the area. But clearly the unknowns are far greater than the knowns in all of this. And this is an experiment that we're carrying out with the unknowing and unconsenting irradiation of huge populations of people around the world. And now we're now seeing, for example, in Japan, raising the bar, allowing children to be exposed to levels of radiation that previously were restricted for nuclear workers. And in my opinion, this is unconscionable. It's like being in a ball game and in the 7th inning deciding that one team is losing, and so they say they're going to change the rules in the middle of the game. These levels were set for a reason, and that's because radiation is not good for you, and there is no safe level of radiation. And so to now change the rules of the game, again, is another unconscionable part of this terrible, cruel, poisonous experiment that we won't know the end result of for hundreds of years.
Dr. Jeff Patterson, thank you so much for being with us. Immediate past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is holding a news conference today to release a new report. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
На Чернобыльской атомной электростанции произошла авария. Поврежден один из атомных реакторов. Принимаются меры по ликвидации последствий аварии. Пострадавшим оказывается помощь. Создана правительственная комиссия.
Was no way they could have known that morning that they awoke upon a fateful day. The killer wind came down without a warning.
Ghost Town, song about Chernobyl by Hans and Dr. Beaker. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We turn now from the radiation disasters in Chernobyl and Japan to look at how the major U.S. weapons manufacturer, Honeywell, pled guilty last month to illegally storing hazardous radioactive waste without a permit. The company kept highly radioactive mud in drums in the open air behind its uranium enrichment plant in Metropolis, Illinois. According to a former Honeywell environmental safety officer, the toxic waste leaked into the Ohio River, which runs next to the plant. Workers at the facility say they notified Honeywell of the problem on many occasions. Many are members of the United Steelworkers Union and feel this particular incident led to the company's desire to bust their union. More than 200 workers at the Metropolis plant have been out of work since last June due to stalled contract negotiations with the company on workplace safety, economic and seniority issues. Dozens of workers protested at the Honeywell shareholder meeting on Monday. Honeywell did not return a call from Democracy Now!, but it released a statement that its, quote, goal remains to reach a fair and equitable settlement with the union. For more, we're joined by the longtime labor reporter Mike Elk, who's covered this story for In These Times magazine. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Mike. Welcome back. Talk quickly about the situation at Honeywell. What happened at the shareholders meeting and what's happened in Metropolis, Illinois?
Yes, well, the workers went to the shareholders' meetings to confront Honeywell CEO David Cote, who's refused to meet with them about the lockout. The workers have been locked out for about 10 months now. This all started, the workers think this started in 2007 when a worker, Joe Jacobs, confronted the company at a town hall meeting, confronted CEO David Cody about these 7,000 drums of radioactive mud being stored behind the plant in an open-air facility that could possibly leak into the Ohio River. He confronted him, and they think this was the beginning of the problems. But however, the company came to the workers this time around in the contract negotiations, asked them to give up their retiree health care, to give up their pensions, and to increase their health care contributions up to about $8,000 a year. And the workers quite simply could not accept this. So they refused to accept the contract. And for the last 10 months, the workers have been locked out. Now, during that time, the company brought in scabs, replacement workers, from a group called the Shaw Group. Now, the Shaw Group has a long history of covering up nuclear, problems at nuclear facilities. They were fined $6.2 million by the federal government in 2009 for forcing its workers not to report safety problems at nuclear facilities in Alabama and Tennessee. Since then, they've come in, there's been many accidents. In August, there was an explosion at the plant when hydrogen and fluoride gas combined. It blew off 2 of the scrubbers at the plant and forced the plant to shut down for several days. I talked with the state police at the time, and they said they had never heard such a loud explosion come from this plant in decades. In September, I found a report from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that showed that Honeywell cheated on the tests, the safety tests, the qualification tests for the scab workers that replaced the locked-out workers. One of these, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission claimed that Honeywell corrected the problem. However, in September, one of the workers who was not following procedure damaged a safety valve on a container of UF6 gas. Now, UF6 gas is highly toxic. A couple puffs of it and you're dead. By not following procedure, he damaged a safety valve, and it released some traces of UF6 gas into the plant. Now, had that safety valve failed completely, there was 10,000 pounds of UF6 gas in that canister, and had that been released, it would have killed everybody within a 6-mile radius of the facility in Metropolis, Illinois. So the workers, and as well in December, there was a release of HF gas where alarms went off for several hours directly into the atmosphere. So there's a long history of problems at this facility, and the problems, it seems, have only gotten worse since they've brought in scabs to run the facility.
Can you talk about the connection between David Cody, the CEO of Honeywell? The shareholders meeting took place in Morris Township this week in New Jersey. Honeywell is based in Morristown, New Jersey. Between the CEO and President Obama.
Well, quite frankly, the CEO of Honeywell, David Cody, is the best friend of President Obama in the business community. Honeywell was the #1 contributor. Their PAC was the #1 contributor to the Democratic Party in the 2010 election cycle. They gave $3.8 million to the Democratic Party. President Obama looked to David Cody to make sure that the Chamber of Commerce wasn't opposed to the stimulus, and keeping the Chamber of Commerce out helped the president pass the stimulus. Also, David Cody was the president's choice to serve on the Deficit Commission, where he advocated things like cutting Social Security and Medicare. And in addition, he serves as the head of the U.S.-India Forum. And while this lockout was going on in Metropolis, Illinois, Honeywell CEO David Cody flew with President Obama to India and toured around India with the president, all while this lockout was going on in southern Illinois.
Can you talk about David Cody's relationship with the union, his history with the workers?
David Cody has had, since he's taken over the company, Honeywell always had pretty good labor relations up until David Cody took over the company a few years ago. Now, since he's come in, he's made it a habit to go about busting unions throughout the company. He's somebody obsessed with power, and he doesn't want workers telling them how to run a company. There was another situation where workers were threatening to strike at a facility that serviced the Marine Corps in Blunt Island, Florida. Now, David Cody, to stop the strike, Honeywell pulled the security clearances of several of the workers and kicked several of them out of their housing on the base in order to stop them from striking. And he even threatened to bring in Marine Corps troops to work their jobs if they did go on strike.
Finally, can you talk about the lack of media attention to what has been taking place with Honeywell? I mean, even the explosion that you described is probably news to most people who are watching or listening.
Yeah, I'm quite frankly baffled by it. I've been writing about this story for about 8 months now. I've probably filed a dozen stories on it. And outside of some great coverage by Lauren Lister of RTTV and Ryan Grimm of the Huffington Post, as well as a brief article in the AP, there hasn't really been much coverage of it. And it just simply astounds me. But it's typical of lockouts in the United States of America. The only reason you're hearing about this lockout now on Democracy Now! At this uranium facility is because it is a uranium facility. It's exciting. There's been a lockout going on just as long at Rolette Factory in Iowa, and almost nobody has heard about that. People don't hear about lockouts, about strikes in this country. They're not considered exciting, and they're not covered by many reporters, even many progressive reporters, because they're seen as local struggles, not as national struggles. But the boss, when the boss sees that a union can be broken in a workplace that can, like Honeywell's, where it only has 200 workers, this is a signal that goes down the line that the boss can break companies nationwide, can break unions nationwide. So it's a struggle, and it's one that I think the workers at Honeywell are willing to go one day longer. So it's absolutely horrendous they haven't gotten more media coverage, because they've been absolutely heroic. They faced asset reposition, because a lot of them have been without money, or some of them have been threatened with foreclosure, and it's gotten no media coverage.
Mike Elk, thanks so much for being with us, assistant editor at In These Times, longtime labor reporter. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, part 2 of our discussion about WikiLeaks. We're going to go to London to speak with the investigations editor at The Guardian, David Lee. Stay with us.
What's next, WikiLeaks? What's next, WikiLeaks? What's next? Don't stop now, we're on the edge of our seats. What's next, WikiLeaks? What's next, WikiLeaks? What's next? Well, don't stop now, we're on the edge of our seats. You have to watch what you say or your words will haunt you. Take extra care when you speak. One of these days you just might find your foot stuck in your cheek. With a flabby old chap and Hitler hobnobbing and the head of a snake, and Batman and Robin, there's just no place to hide your disgrace. You got egg all over your face.
WikiLeaks Samba by Sonic Disobedience. They sent it to us at Facebook. You can send your music videos to us there as well. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to the hundreds of Guantanamo prisoner assessment files used by the U.S. military, recently released by the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks. The 759 Guantanamo files, classified as, quote, secret, cover almost every prisoner since the camp was opened in 2002. They reveal the U.S. believed many of those held at Guantanamo were innocent or low-level operatives. On Sunday, the New York Times and The Guardian UK began publishing in-depth reports on the files. On Monday, the White House condemned the reports.
Release of classified information we condemn in the strongest possible terms. And we think it's unfortunate that the New York Times and others news organizations have made the decision to publish numerous documents obtained illegally concerning the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay.
That was White House Press Secretary Jay Carney. While many of the Guantanamo files are still being analyzed today, The Guardian published a new expose reporting the documents show how a single star informer at the base at Bagram won his freedom by incriminating at least 123 other prisoners there. For more, we're joined from London by Democracy Now! Video stream, The Guardian's investigations executive editor David Lee, who's written extensively on the WikiLeaks Guantanamo files. Thanks so much for being with us. First, respond to the White House's condemnation of this release of documents, David.
Well, the White House has condemned every single release of documents that came out through WikiLeaks, and their condemnation here is just the same. They've not actually done anything about it, and I think you have to look at this as a formulaic kind of condemnation. They're never going to say, we approve of the illegal release of documents and the illegal release of classified information. So I wouldn't take it too seriously. After all, I know that the New York Times consulted the White House before publishing these files and said, we've got them, we're going to publish them, and they had a conversation about that.
David, I just want to ask, do you have the sound up on your computer? I think that's what we're hearing when you're speaking. Is it coming back at you? But so if everyone in the room could turn down the show today, because we want to be able to hear you as clearly as possible. So talk about this, one of the revelations, this star witness, if you will, at Bagram. What did he do? Who was he?
It's one of the most startling things that we actually found going through the files, because, of course, much of the material about Guantanamo and torture has been made public before, but this was brand new. This man's name is Mohammed Basada. He's a Yemeni who was captured on the borders with Pakistan and Afghanistan, where he was apparently trying to flee after the U.S. invasion and the fighting in the Tora Bora Mountains. Since he's been in there in Guantanamo, he's won his freedom by apparently denouncing or implicating at least 123 of his co-prisoners. That's an extraordinary number, and of course it does raise the question whether he has not been exaggerating.
Talk about the other most surprising revelations, what you learned from these documents, David Lee.
The most saddening thing was the descriptions of completely innocent old men and young boys who were shipped off to Guantanamo for no very good reason, except they were rounded up in a dragnet. There's an 89-year-old Afghan villager who was picked up merely because there was a list of suspicious phone numbers and a satellite phone found near his compound. Shipped off to Guantanamo, where they discover he's not only very, very old and doesn't know anything, but he's also suffering from dementia and probably can't even remember what day of the week it is. Similarly, their 14-year-old boy turned out when he arrived there to, in fact, have been kidnapped by pro-Taliban tribesmen and left holding a rifle while they fled around him. Even the Guantanamo commander at the time, Major General Jeffrey Miller, who was a fairly controversial and rigorous figure, shall we say, who later went to the Abu Ghraib prison, even he wrote a memo and signed it saying, we don't know why this boy is here. He really has to be got out of here and sent back to a normal environment, because it's completely wrong that he should be in Guantanamo. You see innocent people being rounded up, shipped off, stuck there, sometimes for years.
One of the prisoners discussed in the documents released by WikiLeaks was Sami al-Hajj, who was working as an Al Jazeera cameraman when he was arrested in late 2001 and sent to Guantanamo, held for more than 6 years. It was a case we covered extensively. Now, we talked about this yesterday as well with Andy Worthington, but today we have a clip of Sami al-Hajj himself, now out, working with Al Jazeera, and he's speaking with Al Jazeera's Nick Clark about his experience at Guantanamo.
Through the interrogations, I realized that the charge brought against me was filming or recording an interview with Osama bin Laden. This is what I understood from the interrogator. I replied to them that I did not carry out this mission as I was covering Kandahar, and if I had done such an interview, it is part of my job. Journalism.
And what happened after that? So all the time that you were there, you weren't ever given any further instruction as to why you were being held?
At that point, when they realized that I am a journalist and they verified my passport on me and other journalistic ID, they told me that you are the man wrongly detained. However, I saw many things which should not be seen. That's why I was kept there for a longer time. After that, most of the interrogations were centered on Al Jazeera channel, who is running the affairs, and how is Al Jazeera linked to Al Qaeda, and how Al Qaeda tapes reach Al Jazeera, etc. Most of the interrogations and investigations wished me to say that there is a link between Al Jazeera and Al Qaeda.
I mean, this is a remarkable story, David Lee, where a lot of what these documents are saying about Sami al-Hajj, the Al Jazeera cameraman, as he was being held to question him about the Al Jazeera leadership and satellites and telecommunications and the filming of Osama bin Laden and other issues?
we all know that the United States and the Bush administration were pretty obsessed with Al Jazeera, and they were pretty furious at the kind of coverage that Al Jazeera was giving, which they couldn't control. This is the first time we've seen hard documentation that they were basically abducting an Al Jazeera employee merely in order to pump him for intelligence about what Al Jazeera was up to and how they got an interview with Osama bin Laden. I think anybody in a media organization across the world is going to be horrified at the thought that the U.S. military could abduct their employees just to do this kind of thing.
At this point, it would be very interesting if news organizations around the world raised a protest, considering it's in the documents that shows. I mean, it's as clear as if a Guardian reporter or an NBC reporter was being held and documents came out years later that showed that the government themselves was saying that they were trying to get information about their employer.
I'm afraid one of the things that comes out of this cascade of WikiLeaks leaks over the last 12 months has been the attitude of the U.S. government towards journalists, media employees who they don't much care about because they're foreigners. The very first disclosure more than a year ago was of how 2 Reuters employees, local employees in Iraq, a cameraman and a driver, had been shot down and killed from the air by an Apache helicopter gunship merely because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I think this contempt for the lives of journalists is something that, unfortunately, the U.S. government seems to be starting to share with other repressive regimes around the world.
I wanted to ask you about another remarkable revelation about what was happening at Guantanamo. The U.S. inviting in at least 10 foreign intelligence agencies to interrogate prisoners and to share information on those that they regarded, quote, as terrorists. So you're talking about China, Tunisia, Morocco, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Tajikistan, Jordan, Algerians, Yemenis, Kuwaitis. They invited China and Russia in to interrogate these prisoners they were holding?
Well, you're seeing the other side of rendition now. In rendition, they were sending shipping prisoners off to foreign agencies such as Morocco, Egypt, and so on, where they were most likely being tortured. Now we see the other side of the picture, where they're inviting in intelligence agencies from all over the world, from very dubious regimes, you know, Algeria, Morocco, Russia even, China, and certainly the Saudis, who they're very close to, and the Yemenis, and saying, come on over, have joint interrogations with us. You can help us because you understand these people. You can tell us whether they're under false names. You can threaten their families, most probably. You can see the picture of something very ugly going on here. I suppose that the military authorities in Guantanamo would say this was a pretty sensible thing to do because these people had a sort of cultural insight into their locals that we don't have. But all the same, these are not nice regimes that the United States is cooperating with.
David Lee, I want to thank you for being with us. People can go, and you can explain the Guardian website, how you have made it interactive, how people can go and find out and read these documents.
Yes, you can not only read the whole documents, but you can also, if you go to the Guardian's website, you can actually see pictures of all the individuals where we've got pictures in. You can just click on them and up will come the full dossier about them. So we think it's a good tool for people to understand more about the realities of Guantanamo as distinct from the spin.
Thank you so much, David Lee, investigations editor at The Guardian. As we turn right now to Dan Ellsberg, I want to turn to President Obama, who was questioned by supporters of accused U.S. Army whistleblower Bradley Manning last week at a fundraiser in San Francisco. The president's comments were recorded on his cell phone. He said that what Bradley Manning had done was different from what Dan Ellsberg had revealed a generation ago. Listen very carefully. This is a cell phone recording.
We're a nation of laws. We don't individually make our own decisions about how the laws operate. No, he's so fine. He's so fine. I mean, he's being courteous and he's asking questions. No, he broke the law. You can make it harder to break the law. Well, what he did was he's dumb. no, it wasn't the same thing. What Ellsberg was wasn't classified the same way. So,
President Obama openly declaring that Bradley Manning, who's yet to stand trial, has broken the law. According to Obama, the cases are not similar because, quote, Ellsberg's material was not classified the same way. Dan Ellsberg is on the phone with us right now, the world-renowned whistleblower who exposed the Pentagon Papers some 40 years ago. Dan, he says, don't compare Bradley Manning with you.
Well, nearly everything the president has said represents a confusion about the state of the law and his own responsibilities. Everyone is focused, I think, on the fact that this commander-in-chief has virtually given a directed verdict to his subsequent jurors, who will all be his subordinates in deciding the guilt in the trial of Bradley Manning. He's told them already that their commander, on who their whole career depends, regards him as guilty, and that they can disagree with that only at their peril. In career terms, it's clearly enough grounds for a dismissal of the charges, just as my trial was dismissed eventually for governmental misconduct. But what people haven't really focused on, I think, is another problematic aspect of what he said. He not only was identifying Bradley Manning as the source of the crime, but he was assuming, without any question, that
Dan, we have 4
a crime has
seconds.
been committed. Hello?
We have 4 seconds, and we're going to have to leave it there, but we're going to pick it up with you tomorrow. Dan Ellsberg, Pentagon's Papers whistleblower. Thanks for joining us.